It is officially 2025 and the Idaho legislature is in session. Now, we've got you covered with a weekly digest on the latest developments coming out of the State House, delivered right to your inbox every Monday morning. It is the Legislative Roundup newsletter written by our very own James Dawson. You can sign up at our website, boisestatepublicradio.org.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. You're listening to Idaho Matters. It's Friday, which means it's time for our Reporter Roundtable. Today, we will get you up to date on the news that made headlines this last week. A lot to get to around the Idaho legislative session. So our panelists today, Ian Mack Stevenson with the Idaho Statesman, Clark Corbin with the Idaho Capitol Sun, and outdoors reporter Nicole Blanchard with the Idaho Statesman. Happy Friday, everybody.
Happy Friday, Gemma.
Let's begin. Yeah, good to hear everybody. So let's begin today with the legislative session. Let's talk a little bit about some backlash that the Democratic minority at the State House received after voting yes on introducing two resolutions targeted at the LGBTQ plus community. So first, can you tell us about how these committee votes normally go? So let's start there and then go into why these Democrats are now rethinking that strategy.
Yeah, absolutely, Gemma. So in the Idaho legislature's committees, how the process generally works is that a lawmaker comes forward with a proposal or an idea for a law that's written down and passed out to the committee. And before it becomes a bill and is publicly debated, it first has to be introduced into the legislature. That's generally called a print hearing and is the first step to getting a bill on its way to passage. Generally, these are viewed as pretty informal votes. They're kind of viewed as part of the process of doing business at the legislature. And even lawmakers who may oppose a bill in the long run will often still vote to introduce them because they kind of believe that an idea from a lawmaker has a right to be debated and heard in the legislature and should be discussed more broadly and should receive public input. And that can't happen unless it's introduced. And that's, I would say, generally how Democrats in the legislature have been operating, over recent decades. The Democrats have a very small minority in the legislature. 86% of seats are controlled by Republicans. And obviously Democrats in Idaho oppose a lot of legislation introduced by Republicans, particularly on social issues. But nevertheless, it's been common that on a lot of those bills, even if they ultimately oppose them, they will vote to print them or introduce them. But this year in the legislature, some of the first pieces of legislation that Republican lawmakers brought were, as you mentioned, related to these two resolutions. So one was about asking the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn its 2015 decision allowing same-sex marriage nationwide. The resolution asks for that decision to be overturned and for marriage only between a man and a woman to be reinstated in the state. And the second resolution was essentially commending the Boise State University volleyball team, which forfeited last year a number of games against a California team that reportedly had a transgender player on their women's team that the Boise State team didn't want to play against. And two Democrats on the House committee that introduced, these pieces of legislation voted to print the bills, voted to introduce them, even though they didn't support the bills. And after that, those introductions happened, those two Democrats received some blowback from their constituents, from LGBTQ plus supporters saying that, why are you allowing this legislation to be introduced, even if you don't support it? And so it kind of introduced a new and interesting dynamic in the legislature, I think, amongst Democrats, where they have as I mentioned, a very fragile and limited power in the state capitol, and what their votes were going to be on introducing those bills. They were going to be introduced regardless of how the Democrats voted. It's not like they were casting decisive votes there. But I think they, early on in the session here, they got some feedback from constituents that, some of their constituents aren't looking for them to kind of go along with the process and would like to see more kind of resistance to the Republican majority going forward.
So with that said, Ian, there was definite swift backlash to these two Democrats who voted to move this forward. So what happened after that? Because this, I have to say, was A, kind of surprising about the vote, but B, I think the swift reaction from constituents.
Yeah, so after some of that backlash, both lawmakers, Representative Brooke Green and Representative Todd Achilles of Boise, apologized for what had happened. And a few days later, actually, the Planned Parenthood director in Idaho criticized the lawmakers for voting to introduce the laws, or the bills, I should say.
Mm.
And at a committee hearing, more recently, the resolution related to Boise State's volleyball team, both lawmakers, it came up for a public hearing, which is the more formal hearing that follows the initial hearing. And both of those, in that instance, both Democrats voted against it. And the resolution on same-sex marriage, we've yet to see that come up for a public hearing. But I think I also talked to leadership in the Democratic Party at the House, Representative Ilana Rubel, and her perspective was basically that she sees the argument going both ways. I think some Democrats feel like if they oppose legislation, and especially with the same-sex marriage resolution, which some of them found quite offensive, that they really should be opposing it at all fronts when they can. But on the other hand, she was saying that some Democrats feel like sort of going along with the process or operating under the philosophy that all bills that lawmakers introduce should get a hearing and should be discussed, in some ways helps Democrats because it might make them, the Republican majority, more likely to hear their ideas when the Democrats have ideas they want to bring to a committee or a bill they want to propose. If they kind of are more amenable to the committee process, that they might have a better chance with their legislation. So we'll have to see how that dynamic plays out further as the session continues.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Appreciate that update. So, Nicole, Idaho's largest healthcare system this week announced it is suing Attorney General Raul Labrador over our state abortion restrictions. Now, they noted they're doing this to try and make sure an injunction from a federal lawsuit is preserved when President-elect Trump takes office. So, Nicole, can we begin with some background on this? Tell us first about this federal lawsuit and then that injunction that was granted over the summer.
This is definitely a long and convoluted process that this lawsuit has been through. This lawsuit, the federal lawsuit, was filed. The Department of Justice sued the state of Idaho in 2022, shortly after our abortion restrictions went into place when Roe v. Wade was repealed. They said, your restrictions are too strict. There's a federal law called EMTALA that requires you to provide treatment to people experiencing medical emergencies, and sometimes that treatment includes abortion. So at various points in this case, there has been an injunction issued which says to healthcare providers, yes, you can provide abortion as emergency care. You do not have to abide by Idaho restrictions in those cases at this present moment.
Mm-hmm.
And that injunction has been removed and reinstated and is currently in place now.
Okay, so right now this injunction is in place. So with this injunction in place, Nicole, why did St. Luke's Health System feel it necessary to take this next step and sue the Attorney General?
Right. So on Monday, President-elect Donald Trump will be inaugurated. We don't know what the Trump administration is going to do with this Department of Justice lawsuit. They could decide to dismiss it. They could continue forward with it. It was brought by the Biden administration. It doesn't necessarily seem like something that the Trump administration would be interested in continuing. And St. Luke's has been outspoken about how their healthcare and their providers have been impacted when the injunction has been lifted in the past. They've said that they've had to airlift patients to hospitals out of state for care. And so this for them was a way to try and get that injunction in place in a different lawsuit so that if anything does happen with this federal lawsuit when Trump takes office, um, they know that they're already kind of covered in that aspect.
So with that said, Nicole, have we heard from the Attorney General's office yet?
So I reached out to the Attorney General's office in December, and they said that they had not heard from Trump's transition team at all about what they plan to do. I reached out to the transition team at that same time and never heard back. And then after St. Luke's filed this lawsuit this week, I did reach out to the Attorney General's office again to see if they had heard anything, any plans for what will happen with this federal lawsuit, and they did not respond to my request.
Okay, and so they did not give you a statement or anything from the Attorney General's office, Nicole?
Nope, they did not. So it's really unclear what the Trump administration plans to do at this point.
Okay, and we have not heard anything from the Justice Department over this either, I'm
We
assuming.
have not.
Okay, appreciate that update, Nicole.
Mhm.
Okay, so Clark, let's talk about Add the Words. And I want to start with a personal bill that Idaho Senate Minority Leader Melissa Wintrow brought forward yesterday. So Clark, before we get into this bill itself, can you give folks some history on Add the Words? Maybe begin by taking us back, about a decade now, when legislators and citizens started trying to add words to our state's Human Rights Act.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Jim. And I think this has maybe actually been going on for 15 or even 20 years. But it kind of starts with the Idaho Human Rights Act, which is a part of Idaho law that starts off saying it shall be prohibited to discriminate against a person on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And so what some legislators and some members of the public have been pushing for 15 to 20 years is to amend the Idaho Human Rights Act to add the words sexual orientation and gender identity to prohibit discrimination against individuals based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. And this really comes down to enacting basic protections in housing and in the workplace for LGBTQ plus Idahoans. It's an effort that's been going on for at least 15 years, but the Republican Party that holds the supermajority, kind of this process that we talked about at the beginning of the show, has actually blocked Democrats from introducing a bill to add the words to amend the Idaho Human Rights Act through the committee process, through this formal legislative process that we have. And so what we saw yesterday on Thursday morning was Senate Minority Leader Melissa Wintrow, a Boise Democrat, introduced a bill to do just that, to amend the Idaho Human Rights Act to add the words sexual orientation and gender identity. But she had to do it as a personal bill because Republicans had blocked it from going through the committee process. And what this means is that the bill is doomed. The bill will not advance because it's been blocked from the official committee process that legislators use to introduce bills and kind of move them on their legislative journey from becoming a bill to law. I talked with Senator Wintrow about it yesterday. She said she tried again this year, and the bill was blocked. It wouldn't be introduced by the Senate State Affairs Committee. And so she brought it as a personal bill to show Idahoans that she cares, to get the proposal out in front of the public. It's on the legislature's website right now. I believe it's Senate Bill 1002. But to get it out there, to have a conversation, and to signal to the public that she and the Democratic Party and allies are pushing for these changes, but the Republican Party, Gemma, continues to block them. That's why it's going this personal route as opposed to going through the committee process where we see the overwhelming vast majority of bills from the legislature originate.
Mm-hmm. So, Clark, Ian mentioned this in the last segment, and these are certain bills that have been introduced in regards to the LGBTQ plus community. So, as Senator Wintrow introduces this bill, I think it's safe to say that there are GOP legislators who are going in the opposite direction. And in fact, talk to us a little bit more about this House Joint Memorial 1 that they introduced. And as Ian said, this has to do with same-sex marriage.
Yeah, absolutely. House Joint Memorial 1 was one of the very first bills of this 2025 legislative session. And although it doesn't have the force and effect of law, it's an official message from the Idaho legislature calling on the U.S. Supreme Court. I'm using words from the bill here to restore the definition of marriage as a union between one man and one woman, and also to allow states to enforce laws pertaining to marriage. And so it's not a law in itself, but it's representing the Idaho legislature, should it pass, should it be adopted, calling on the U.S. Supreme Court to change the definition of marriage and to let states enforce laws pertaining to marriage. There's a couple key points to talk about here. Obviously, this was the bill that some Democrats were criticized for voting to introduce, and we talk about respecting the process. Well, the same process Republicans are using to block Senator Wintrow's bill seeking to add the words. And so when we talk about process, they're absolutely moving in different directions here. Yeah, like I said, the first bill, which was introduced, which is going through the official committee process, is calling on the Supreme Court to change the definitions of marriage, to let Idaho enforce it. And then it's notable that the Idaho Constitution itself still defines marriage as a union between one man and one woman. That's at odds, obviously, with the U.S. Supreme Court. So that's kind of the background and the context, but it's absolutely true that they're going in different directions. I did want to point out that later this month, there's a rally and protest taking place on January 28th. That's going to be at the Idaho State Capitol building here in Boise at noon. And then later that day at 6 p.m. at the Linen Building, also in Boise on Grove Street there. I spoke with Nixon Matthews yesterday, who heads up the Queer Caucus from the Idaho Democratic Party. And Nixon talked about the protest, encouraging people, whether they're members of the LGBT plus community or allies, to come out and make their voices heard. Nixon was very concerned about the legislative environment and then the overall environment nationally when we talk about President-elect Trump taking office next week. And so Nixon said this is a chance for Idahoans to come out on January 28th and share their perspective and let Idaho legislators know how they feel about this issue, Gemma.
Appreciate that, Clark. Okay, so Clark, I want to also talk about another issue that's kind of being talked about quite a bit and becoming a bit of a hot button issue, and this is state employee pay. So this is a conversation happening at the State House. So I want to start with the fact that the legislature actually delayed action on proposed pay raises. So Clark, why did they do this?
The short answer, Gemma, is because they couldn't reach an agreement yesterday morning. There was a really rocky committee hearing on Thursday morning with the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee, or JFAC for short. That's the powerful legislative committee that sets all the budgets for all the state agencies and departments. On the schedule, on the agenda for yesterday, they were supposed to act on state pay and benefits for state employees, but they couldn't come to agreement, and they didn't even call the vote. They had a series of motions that were put forward, and then there were some errors made, and they were corrected and amended, but then they were ultimately withdrawn and abandoned. It does seem like the legislature is going to take this up later this legislative session. They're not just completely walking away from it, but we're moving ahead with setting the budgets for next year. And at this point, we don't have pay increases for state employees in there. And it's kind of an interesting issue. But Gemma, this has been something that's been sort of teed up for weeks. Before the 2025 legislative session even began, the Idaho Division of Human Resources gave a presentation to legislators where they basically said that state employees are so underpaid that if they took their same job and did it anywhere else, they would almost certainly be paid more for doing the same job. And so the Division of Human Resources recommended a 4% raise for all state employees. On the first day of the session, Governor Little recommended either a 5% raise or $1.55 an hour for state employees. One of the big debates yesterday, when they couldn't reach an agreement over state pay and benefits for employees, Gemma, was whether to award the pay increase to all employees, um, period, as a cost of living increase, or to give it to high performing employees based on merit. And they couldn't agree on that. And so they didn't even vote. But it's a big deal because there's about 25,000 state employees, Gemma, and the state of Idaho is one of the largest employers in Idaho, as you might expect.
Right. And we have some of the lowest state pay across the nation, we should note. With that said, though, Clark, there's a committee of Idaho legislators that are assigned to study pay, right? And to study benefits. And you mentioned this 5% or $1.55 an hour raise. They've actually recommended this, but I also want you to talk about the fact that in the midst of all of this, right? So they couldn't come to an agreement yesterday. We do have this committee. It's fair to talk about the fact that state legislators are set to get a 25% pay increase.
Yeah, that's exactly right. While the Idaho legislators are arguing over whether to give $1.55 an hour or 4% or 5%, the state legislators themselves are up for a 25% raise. And it's worth noting here that legislators are seasonal employees, Gemma. I think, as you know, and a lot of your listeners know, the legislature is only in session for about 80 to 90 days a year. And so the raise that legislators are getting is a raise from about 19,000 plus dollars a year to $25,000 a year. It's about a 25% raise. You know, contrast that to the 4 or 5% proposals of the $1.55 an hour. So it's a much, much larger increase that the legislators themselves would get, even though they're not full-time, permanent year-round employees. They're getting a much bigger pay increase than is even proposed or considered for the state employees who, as you'd mentioned, there's data out there showing that salaries for state employees, obviously it lags the private sector, but there's new information coming out that pay for Idaho state employees is also lagging behind other city and county government jobs. And so it's been quite an issue. And the Division of Human Resources talked about how turnover is a major issue with the state. I think it's 19% turnover is the latest numbers I'd seen for state employees. And that comes with a couple of costs. Every time an employee leaves, as you might imagine, the replacement has to be hired and trained, and that comes with a cost. And it also can affect the services that are given by the state government. If there's quite a bit of turnover, or if there's new employees or large vacancies, that can affect the services that Idahoans depend on from their state government. So it has a direct impact to 25,000 people and their families who are wondering what their pay and benefits are going to be next year. But it has even wider effects across the state when you talk about the families, when you talk about the work and the services and the impact on government. So it is a big, wide-ranging issue. And I do want to emphasize that the legislature is not saying no raises. They just couldn't reach an agreement yesterday. And so they're going to come back and take it up again. But as of now, they haven't specified a date when they would vote on those salary and benefit packages there for employees, Gemma.
And we should note that, legislators, as you said, Clark, are set to get this, $25,000 for this seasonal work. The majority of legislators also have full-time jobs on top of this, just to note. But Ian, I want you to come into this conversation because we've got some developing news in regards to state employee pay that you literally just found out about.
Yeah, so this happened actually less than an hour ago, but it's a bit of a complicated process. But I just thought to mention, in discussing the proposed pay increases for state lawmakers, one lawmaker, Senator Christy Zitto, introduced a measure to reject the pay increase. So the process for setting lawmakers' pay, there's a committee that sets their raises. So lawmakers can't decide what it is themselves, but they are allowed to reject a pay increase if they or modify it if they see fit. And just less than an hour ago, the Senate passed that resolution to reject the pay increase. So it still has to go to the House. This was just the passing the first body. But I think that's a fight that we're going to see continue to play out at the legislature, with some lawmakers feeling like the pay that they get is way too little for the amount that they are expected to work, and also too little to kind of attract high quality lawmakers who are committed to their jobs. And on the other hand, a number of lawmakers saying that when constituents are struggling to feed their families, put food on the table, why should we be getting such a large raise at this time?
Mm-hmm. Well, definitely, as you said, this is not the end of that conversation. There is a bill that's been introduced in the State House that would give local law enforcement the ability to arrest and charge immigrants who are living in Idaho that don't have legal status. So, Ian, can you tell us more about how this bill works? Because my understanding is that historically, isn't this something that federal authorities deal with, not local law enforcement?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. The precedent on immigration matters, that's been, mostly and previously established in courts, is that this is really a matter that's generally reserved to the federal government to make decisions about. It's connected to foreign policy. It's connected to the nation as a whole, how much immigration the country, sees fit to legally allow, and that's how courts have generally interpreted it. But this Idaho law that's been bill that's been introduced, I should say, is essentially a copy of a Texas law that passed last year, which gives, as you said, local law enforcement and local judges authority to enforce federal immigration law. So it would allow local charges of a misdemeanor for illegal entry or re-entry into the U.S. And a second offense on that could be a charge of a felony. And I think perhaps most notably, it essentially would give magistrate judges, local judges in the state, authority to issue what amount to basically deportation orders, ordering people in the country without legal status to return to their home country. And the Texas law, I should say, is not being enforced at the moment. It's been paused in the courts. And I think it's fair to say has a pretty uphill battle to getting, to being deemed allowed to go into effect at all. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is, widely viewed as in general, a pretty conservative appeals court in the U.S. It's in Texas, has already kind of indicated that it's a likely unconstitutional bill because it infringes on the supremacy of the federal government to control immigration matters. And so I think kind of in similarity, the Idaho law, if it were to pass, would similarly likely have an uphill battle. I spoke with a law professor at University of Idaho who told me that, this is basically 150 years of precedent that immigration matters have been enforced solely by the federal government. And this would be a big change to that. But at the same time, obviously Republicans in Idaho and nationally are very concerned about people entering the country without legal status. President-elect Trump has promised mass deportations, and there's a lot of appetite on the right to really crack down on undocumented immigrants. And so I think we'll see. We'll have to see where this law goes this session. But I think it's very likely, if it does pass the legislature and get signed by the governor, we'll likely see some court challenges as well.
Right, similar to what Texas is going through right now, I would assume, Ian.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So, Clark, the Chief Justice of the Idaho Supreme Court was at the State House earlier this week, actually giving the annual State of the Judiciary address. And he made a case as to why judges should be paid more. So can you tell us what he said? Because even though Idaho judges are, I believe, 48th in the nation when it comes to pay, that wasn't his entire argument. I mean, he talked about other things like caseload, complexity of cases. So can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, for sure. This was on Wednesday, and Idaho Supreme Court Chief Justice G. Richard Bevin came and gave, this is an annual speech that he gives to the Idaho legislature, both the full Idaho Senate and the full Idaho House. And you're absolutely right. He highlighted that pay for Idaho district judges ranks 48th across the country when you add in the different states and territories. But it isn't just the low pay, as you mentioned, it's caseload, which really just means the number of cases that judges are handling, and then the complexity of the cases. But he said that Idaho ranks near the bottom nationally. We're lower than all of one of our neighboring states, and it's creating a lot of problems. It's creating, according to the Chief Justice Bevin, it's creating a strain on the legal system, and it threatens their ability because the more time that judges are hearing cases or traveling from different counties to help out with caseloads in other counties, that means that they have less time to actually research and write their opinions. But just to give you a couple of examples, Justice Bevin talked about the workload that judges in Twin Falls County are handling. He talked about one district judge closing out 424 criminal cases and another 198 civil cases just last year alone. And so the problem is that not enough young, highly effective attorneys are seeking out judgeships because they can make more money as an attorney than they ever would as a judge. You're also seeing judges leave the bench, leave the profession early because of the workload, because of the pay issues, and they're not being replaced with new judges or younger attorneys at the same level. And so there's quite a bit of concerns there. There's kind of two requests that Justice Bevin made. One was he's asked for some additional judges to help out at the county level. I think I heard something about 4 additional judges that they're requesting to help out with some of that workload, some of that caseload. And then what they really want to do is bring up the salaries for Court of Appeals judges, district courts judges, and magistrate judges to where they're at or above $200,000 or close to $200,000. Obviously, that is a lot of money when we talk about like the average salary of an Idahoan. But when you look in the legal profession and you look at the amount of experience and education that a judge has to have and the amount of money that attorneys are paid, it isn't that high. In fact, it's very low when we talk about within the legal profession. For example, right now, I think it's set in state law that the magistrate judge salary for this year is about $147,000. Under the proposal from the Idaho Supreme Court, that would go up to $193,000, while the district court judge salaries would go up to $201,000. So it's kind of talking about everything really affecting it. The low salary, and it's low compared to their peers. It's low compared to other states. It's low compared to attorneys in private practice. But then that high caseload of just hundreds of cases that judges are working with. Justice Bevin really said it affects the quality of the legal system, and that when we're doing all these other things, there's less time to research and write the opinions that are part of the legal process. So an interesting discussion. The Supreme Court had actually put it out just before the legislative session began. And, again, it really fits into some of these pay issues that we're talking about that the Idaho legislature looks like going to be wrestling with this year. Obviously, the legislature and the judicial branch are separate branches of government. There's been some friction between the legislature and the other branches of government. And so I'm not exactly sure how this one will play out. But Justice Bevin made a pretty strong case on Wednesday, and he brought some numbers, and he said that it wasn't just about the money either. So a really interesting proposal, Gemma, that the legislature hasn't taken action on yet. But as these budgets move forward, and as the budgets for the judicial branch move forward, we'll be looking at that.
Well, what I found interesting too, Clark, was that during this address, Chief Justice Bevin also said, "Look, even if you give us these requested pay increases, we're not going to be at the top of the list.
Right.
I mean, they will still not be paid as well as the majority of other judges across the country. And another thing I wanted to point out, Clark, and maybe you can talk about this a little bit more, is when he talked about, recruitment and retention, right? He said specifically there are experienced judges that are literally announcing their retirement and they are going back into private practice as attorneys where they can make more money and frankly have a smaller caseload. And I can tell you, in fact, there are two judges in Ada County that recently put in they are retiring. One has more than a decade as a judge. Both are going back into private practice. This is a real issue.
Yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that. I thought that was a really interesting point that the justice made. And you're exactly right. He had some numbers there, but talking about the experienced judges who are announcing their retirement, but then they're going back into the legal profession, not as judges, but as attorneys, because they're going to do less work and they're going to make more money. And so I thought that was really, really interesting and kind of speaks to sort of the net effect, the end result, if you will, of these dynamics in play. But yeah, he did point out that even with the increases, it's not going to bring them to the top. It's not going to make them the highest paid judges around. It would be more about moving them off the bottom and raising the ceiling. And the salary increase would affect the Supreme Court justices too. But I talked with some of the staff, not the judges, but some of the staff in the judicial branch,
Mm-hmm.
and they talked about the way that the salary is structured in law. It's tied to the Supreme Court justices, so they're affected too. But the goal is really to bring up the salaries for those magistrate judges, the district judges, and the Court of Appeals judges, which right now today range from about $147,000 a year up to about 161,000 for the Court of Appeals, and they want to move those closer to 200,000 a year or over 200,000 a year. But I think it's interesting and it's telling when you see the judges leaving what should be viewed as maybe the top of their profession, something that you would
Right.
strive for
Yeah.
throughout your whole career to obtain a judgeship, but then walking away from it and returning to practice as an attorney because the money and the workload are more desirable. I thought that was an interesting point, and I'm glad you picked up on it, Gemma.
And Clark, didn't he also ask for an independent committee to be set up to look at judicial pay? And isn't this, let's go back quickly to when we talked about last segment about the legislators being set to get this 25% pay increase. If I recall correctly, there was an independent committee that made that recommendation for legislators. So the Chief Justice is also asking for something very similar so that it isn't biased, because as you mentioned, there has been a lot of tension between our legislature and other branches of government, in particular the judiciary.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Justice Bevin did ask for the legislature to consider creating a new independent committee or commission, perhaps a citizens commission, to make recommendations about judicial salaries. The legislature would still be able to, I believe, review it or have a review role, so they would still play a role. But yes, that would make it more like the system that came up with the pay increase for legislators that we had talked about. And I appreciate Ian jumping in with the latest and greatest news, because as you know, the news doesn't stop out of the state capitol building. But yes, the judge did ask, in addition to the raises, he would like consideration of an independent commission or committee to recommend increases for judges in a similar way to the Independent Citizens Committee that recommends the pay increases for the state legislators. And so, interesting proposal there, and I know we'll all stay tuned.
Nicole, the Department of Justice is charging some property managers with rent price fixing. Can you first tell us about this case?
Sure. So the Department of Justice filed this case, I believe, in 2023, and at the time it was only against a software company called RealPage. They make software that property managers can use to figure out how to set prices and other, clerical tasks. So the Department of Justice recently refiled in that case to expand it to include some of the largest property management companies in the country, including a couple that manage several properties primarily in the Boise area, but across Idaho. And the allegation is that they use this software to kind of help them talk amongst each other and figure out how to set prices in a way where renters weren't getting kind of the natural competition of the market that would make prices more affordable.
Hmm. And Nicole, the DOJ says some of those property managers are in Boise, correct?
Yes, so two of the property managers, two of the six that the DOJ added to its lawsuit operate properties in Idaho. They are Graystar and Cortland. And then Washington Post investigation identified another property manager that's not in this DOJ lawsuit, but it has been accused in other lawsuits of similar price fixing with RealPage, and that would be Avenue 5.
All right. Thanks for that. Ian, I have about 2 minutes left, but I want to quickly talk about a bill that's been introduced in the State House that would aim to protect free speech. Can you tell us what it's called anti-SLAPP legislation?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try to be quick here. So it's kind of a wonky term. It stands for Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation. And the general idea is these are lawsuits that you might see filed by a powerful actor who has, in many cases, a lot of money, who might not think that they're going to win their lawsuit or be relying on their lawsuit, but instead is filing a lawsuit because they know that it'll financially strain and otherwise cause stress and time commitments to their opponents. These are and so what's broadly categorized as SLAPP lawsuits have in previous cases been filed against media outlets by powerful players who perhaps don't like how they're covered in the press, or by other powerful players against dissidents or other groups. And so more than half of states now have protections against SLAPP lawsuits. And the basic idea is that it sets up a process in the state courts for if a person thinks they've had a SLAPP lawsuit filed against them, they will you can quickly file a motion and ask a judge to review that and confirm that it is or is not a SLAPP lawsuit. And then otherwise, if it's not, the judge can allow the case to go forward. And if it is considered a SLAPP lawsuit, the judge can throw out the case and require the person who filed it to pay the attorney fees of the defendant. And so if this law were to pass, Idaho would kind of join a large group of states that have protections against this kind of legal activity.
All right. Thanks for that update. And I want to thank our panelists today, Ian Max Stevenson with the Idaho Statesman, Clark Corbin with the Idaho Capital Sun, and outdoors reporter Nicole Blanchard, who is also with the Idaho Statesman. And that'll do it for this episode of Idaho Matters. Thanks so much for listening. And just a reminder, you can find all of our episodes wherever you get your podcasts.
If you like podcasts like this, explore more from the Boise State Public Radio podcast family. There you'll find a mix of daily news, Idaho Voices, and in-depth series on a wide range of topics. I'm talking wild horses, political scandals, sustainable ranching, and militia groups in a post-January 6th world. Wherever you get your podcasts, just search Boise State Public Radio to find what Idaho's NPR station has in store for you.